The Starstrider, Earth's flagship for diplomatic missions, hung in orbit above Aara 7 like a silver dagger against the violet and gold sky of the planet below. Mark Nolan, Earth's ambassador to the Coalition of Unified Species, stood at the observation deck, one hand gripping the railing, the other toying with the silver insignia on his jacket. It wasn't nerves, he told himself. He'd been through dozens of diplomatic negotiations, but something about the Vorocs had a way of getting under his skin. The Vorocs were renowned throughout the galaxy for their mastery of bioengineering and medicine. Their regenerative abilities were near legendary, and their disdain for physically weaker species, like humans, was thinly veiled. The ambassador had been warned by his own team, don't take the bait. The Vorocs love to test you, but they're too valuable to alienate. Still, he was here for diplomacy, not a popularity contest. Ambassador Nolan, came Commander Ray's calm voice over the intercom. We've reached the rendezvous coordinates. The Voroc delegation is awaiting your arrival. Mark took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and made his way to the shuttle bay. His team was already assembled: 3 Marines and Dr. Aara, a human medic assigned to the mission as a gesture of goodwill. They boarded the shuttle in silence, the hum of the engines the only sound as they descended to Aara 7's surface. The meeting site was a broad plateau overlooking a shimmering canyon. The Voroc delegation stood waiting, their tall, sinewy forms draped in flowing metallic robes that seemed to ripple like water. Their gray skin gleamed under the planet's twin suns, and their luminous amber eyes tracked every movement with unsettling precision. Ambassador Nolan, the lead Voroc, Talir, greeted him with a nod. His voice was cool and measured. Welcome to Aara 7. I trust your journey was uneventful. So far, Mark replied with a polite smile. He stepped forward to exchange formalities, but before he could begin, the plateau erupted in chaos. From the rocky outcroppings above, blaster fire rained down. Mark barely had time to dive behind a jagged boulder as his security team returned fire. The Vorocs, for their part, stood eerily still, their regenerative abilities allowing them to shrug off minor injuries with disdainful ease. Ambassador shouted Sergeant Egan, one of the Marines. We've got hostile forces closing in from the north. Looks like anti-coalition rebels. Mark peered around the boulder. The rebels were heavily armed, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with ruthless efficiency, pinning down the delegation and cutting off escape routes. His heart pounded as he assessed the situation. Retreat was impossible, and reinforcements were at least 15 minutes away. We need to hold this position, Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Protect the Vorocs at all costs. Egan gave a grim nod, barking orders to his squad. Mark turned to see Talir watching him with an inscrutable expression. Your physiology is unsuited for combat, Talir observed, his tone almost dispassionate. You should retreat to a safer location. Not an option, Mark shot back. These rebels want to take us all out. If we don't hold the line, we're all done for. Before Talir could respond, Mark spotted a young Marine pinned under a slab of debris near the edge of the plateau. The soldier's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood pooled beneath him, staining the ground a vivid red. Stay here, Mark ordered Talir, not waiting for a reply. He darted into the open, zigzagging through enemy fire as adrenaline surged through his veins. He dropped to his knees beside the injured Marine, bracing himself against the scorching heat of a nearby blaster strike. You're gonna be okay, Mark said, gripping the Marine's shoulder. He scanned the debris. It was heavy, but not immovable. Gritting his teeth, he wedged his hands under the slab and heaved with everything he had. Muscles burned, sweat poured down his face, and for a moment he thought his body might give out. But the slab shifted, just enough to free the soldier's leg. Got you, Mark muttered, slinging the Marine's arm over his shoulder. Together they hobbled back to cover, collapsing behind a rocky outcrop where Dr. Aara was already setting up a field kit. You're insane, Aara hissed, but there was admiration in her eyes. You could have been killed. Not the first time I've been called crazy, Mark replied, wincing as he caught his breath. Talir approached, his amber eyes studying Mark as if he were an enigma. You risked your life for another. Why? Mark frowned at the question. Why wouldn't I? Talir tilted his head. Your species is fragile. your regenerative abilities nearly non-existent. Logic dictates that you prioritize self-preservation. Mark gave a short laugh. Logic's got nothing to do with it. We don't leave our own behind. Talier's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Fascinating. Before Mark could respond, a sharp whistle split the air. Reinforcements had arrived, coalition gunships swooping in to drive off the remaining rebels. The battle was over, but the tension lingered as medics tended to the wounded and the delegation regrouped. As they boarded the shuttle back to the Starstrider, Talier sat across from Mark, his expression pensive. Ambassador Nolan, your actions today have defied my understanding of human behavior. You are, by all accounts, a perplexing species. Mark leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Stick around, Talier. We're full of surprises. Talier's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. I intend to. The Starstrider returned to its orbit, and the diplomatic team gathered in the ship's medical bay. Mark Nolan sat on the edge of a treatment pod as Dr. Linara carefully dressed the burn on his arm. He winced but waved off her glare. I've had worse, he said, trying to sound casual. Sure, and if I weren't here, you'd probably slap a bandage on it and call it a day, Linara retorted. Ambassador or not, you need to stop using yourself as a shield. Before Mark could respond, the doors slid open and Talier entered. The Voroc's graceful movements were oddly out of place in the sterile, human-designed room. He inclined his head toward Linara, then focused his glowing amber eyes on Mark. Ambassador Nolan, I request your presence on my vessel. I believe you will find it enlightening. Mark raised an eyebrow. What's this about? Talier clasped his hands behind his back. Your actions during the engagement on Aara 7 have raised certain questions among my people. I wish to conduct a deeper examination of your species' response to stress, injury, and cooperation. You would be our guest. An experiment, Linara cut in, her tone sharp. He's not a lab rat. Of course not, Talier said smoothly. This would be entirely voluntary, and beneficial, I assure you. Mark hesitated. Something about Talier's intense curiosity made him uneasy, but he couldn't deny the potential for improved relations. Fine, he said, sliding off the pod. But no needles. Talier's expression remained neutral. Agreed. The Voroc vessel, Orion, was unlike anything Mark had seen. Its organic design made the corridors feel alive, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly as if the ship itself breathed. He was led to a chamber where dozens of Voroc medics awaited, their gazes as clinical as Talier's. They began by scanning his vital signs, their instruments producing holographic displays that hung in the air like glowing ribbons. Talier gestured to one of the projections, a model of Mark's circulatory system. Fascinating, Talier murmured. Your cardiovascular response during the skirmish suggests extreme stress, yet you maintained focus and acted decisively. Why? Why, Mark echoed. Because I had to. People were depending on me. Talier's luminous eyes narrowed slightly. Other species would retreat to ensure their survival. Your actions defy that instinct. Mark shrugged. Maybe it's just how we're wired. Talier gestured, and the medics began their tests. They subjected Mark to simulated environments designed to mimic extreme conditions: low oxygen, high pressure, even controlled exposure to intense cold. Each time, they observed his responses with detached interest, noting every grimace and bead of sweat. Humans are remarkable in their inefficiency, Talier said at one point, almost to himself. Your bodies are so easily damaged, yet your persistence is inexplicable. Mark smirked. We call it resilience. Talier raised an eyebrow. Resilience implies a capacity for recovery. Your species does not recover easily. Maybe not, Mark admitted. But we don't give up either. The tests continued, each one more grueling than the last. By the end of the day, Mark was exhausted, his muscles aching and his patience wearing thin. Yet he noticed something strange. Talier's usual air of superiority had softened, replaced by something like curiosity. You do not complain, Talier observed as Mark sat catching his breath. Even when the tasks are difficult. Why? Mark gave him a tired grin. Because complaining doesn't get the job done. Talier's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Your perspective is unique. Before Mark could respond, an alarm echoed through the chamber. A Voroc aide approached Talir, speaking rapidly in their melodic language. Talir's demeanor stiffened, and he turned to Mark. A distress signal has been received from a human vessel. The Orion Dawn has sustained critical damage in a nearby asteroid field. Their casualties are significant. Mark's fatigue vanished in an instant. How far are we? Less than an hour at maximum speed, Talir replied. We are dispatching medical drones to assess the situation. Forget the drones, Mark said, already heading for the door. I'm going. Talir frowned. Your presence is unnecessary. My team is more than capable of handling the situation. These are my people, Mark snapped. I'm not sitting this out. Talir hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Very well. But understand that your presence will complicate matters. Mark didn't care. Minutes later, he was aboard the Voroc medical shuttle, watching the asteroid field grow larger on the view screen. The sight of the damaged Orion Dawn twisted something in his chest. Fires raged along the ship's hull, and debris floated in the black void like broken shards of glass. As the shuttle docked, Talir handed Mark a rebreather mask and a compact medical kit. Do not overexert yourself, Ambassador. We are here to study human behavior, not to rescue you. Mark didn't reply. The moment the airlock hissed open, he stepped into the chaos. Smoke and alarms filled the corridors, and injured crew members were scattered everywhere. He wasted no time, moving from one person to the next, assessing injuries and stabilizing them as best he could. Talir followed closely, his gaze sharp and analytical. Your methods are crude, Talir remarked, as Mark improvised a splint for a woman with a broken arm, yet effective. Glad you approve, Mark muttered, sweat dripping down his face. At one point, Mark came across a young engineer trapped under a collapsed beam. The boy's breathing was shallow, his eyes wide with terror. Mark dropped to his knees, gripping the beam with both hands. Hold on, he said. I'll get you out. Talir stepped forward. Ambassador, this is ill-advised. The strain could cause. Help me or move, Mark snapped. For a moment, Talir seemed to consider refusing. Then, with a resigned sigh, he joined Mark. Together they heaved the beam off the boy, who gasped as the weight was lifted from his chest. Mark hoisted him onto his shoulder and carried him to the shuttle, his legs trembling with the effort. When the last survivor was loaded aboard, Mark collapsed onto a bench, utterly spent. Talir stood over him, his expression unreadable. You humans are utterly illogical, Talir said, almost to himself. And yet, I find myself compelled to understand you. The shuttle's return to the Aara was tense. The Voroc medical crew worked with clinical precision, stabilizing the injured miners as they floated in the zero-gravity medbay. Mark Nolan sat slumped against the wall, his chest rising and falling heavily. Despite the fatigue gnawing at him, his eyes remained fixed on the young engineer he had rescued. The boy, no older than 20, lay unconscious, his face pale but breathing steady. Talir stood nearby, observing the scene with his characteristic detachment. He spoke in quiet tones to his staff, issuing instructions in the flowing Voroc language. When he approached Mark, his tone was measured but carried a hint of something unspoken. Ambassador Nolan, your vital signs indicate severe fatigue and elevated stress levels. You should rest. I'm fine, Mark said gruffly, waving him off. How's the kid? Talir glanced toward the engineer. His injuries are serious but treatable. Voroc technology ensures a high probability of survival. Good, Mark said, leaning his head back against the cool wall. Then I'll rest when everyone's stable. Talir hesitated, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. This behavior of yours, prioritizing others over your own well-being, is highly irregular among sentient species. Why do you persist? Mark opened one eye and smirked. Call it stubbornness. Stubbornness, Talir repeated, as if testing the word, a trait that frequently leads to unnecessary mortality. Mark chuckled dryly, though it quickly turned into a wince. Maybe, but it's also why that kid's alive. Talir said nothing, but his gaze lingered on Mark for a long moment before he turned back to his team. When the shuttle docked with the Aaren, the injured humans were transferred to the Voroc medical bay, a cavernous chamber filled with bioluminescent machinery. The air was thick with a sterile, almost organic smell, and the walls pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of a living organism. Mark watched as the Vorocs worked, their movements efficient and precise. Their regenerative capabilities were woven into their medical practices. Biomaterials harvested from their own bodies were used to treat burns, fractures, and internal injuries. It was impressive, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. "Where's Lenara?" he asked Talir, who was scanning a holographic chart. "The human medic remained aboard your ship to assist with post-mission triage," Talir replied. "Our facilities are superior for acute treatment." Mark frowned. "Your facilities are great, sure, but sometimes it helps to have someone who understands what we're feeling." Talir looked genuinely perplexed. "Emotions are irrelevant to effective treatment." "Not to us, they're not," Mark said. "Sometimes knowing someone cares can make all the difference." Talir tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Curious. Mark followed as Talir led him to a secluded observation chamber overlooking the medbay. Below, a Voroc medic treated the young engineer, weaving thin strands of bioluminescent material over his chest. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and Mark felt a wave of relief. "You see," Talir said, "with our methods, he will recover fully within hours. Your presence was unnecessary." Mark turned to him, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, but when he wakes up, he'll remember that someone cared enough to carry him out of danger. That matters." Talir's gaze didn't waver. "To you, perhaps. To him, it is survival that will matter most." Mark sighed, crossing his arms. "You don't get it, do you? Survival isn't just about breathing. It's about hope, about knowing someone's got your back. That's what makes us human." Talir fell silent, his luminous eyes reflecting the light of the medbay below. For once, he seemed at a loss for words. The quiet was interrupted by a sharp alarm. A Voroc aide appeared in the doorway, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Talir straightened, his expression sharpening. "A critical patient from the Orion Dawn has entered cardiac arrest," he translated for Mark's benefit. "Their condition is unstable." Mark was already moving. "Take me there." In the medbay, a woman lay on a treatment table, her face pale and her breath shallow. The Voroc medics worked frantically, but their methods, automated and detached, seemed to fall short. Talir joined the team, his hands moving with fluid precision as he manipulated a series of biotechnological tools. "It's not enough," Mark said, his heart pounding. He recognized the woman, Captain Vega, the Orion Dawn's commanding officer. She had been on countless missions, always looking out for her crew. She deserved better than this. "Her condition is beyond salvageable by your physiology standards," Talir said calmly. "We will ease her passing." Mark's eyes blazed. "The hell you will. Get me an aid and an IV kit." Talir looked at him as though he just asked for a bucket and mop. "Primitive tools will not." Now Mark barked. Talir hesitated but complied, his expression unreadable. Mark grabbed the defibrillator pads and positioned them over Vega's chest, his hands steady despite the sweat dripping from his brow. "Clear," he shouted, and the device delivered a jolt. Vega's body jerked, but the monitors remained flatlined. Again Mark muttered, his jaw tight. "Come on, Vega. Don't you quit on me." He delivered another shock, then another, his voice hoarse as he called out to her. Finally, on the third attempt, the monitors beeped weakly. Her breathing steadied, shallow but present. Mark sagged against the table, his hands trembling. Talir watched in silence, his usually serene expression marked by a flicker of something like awe. "You revived her," Talir said, his voice low, despite all logical predictions. "Yeah," Mark said, his voice thick. "Because she needed someone to fight for her." Talir's gaze remained fixed on him, and for the first time his detached demeanor seemed to falter. "Perhaps. There is more to human resilience than I understood." The Aaren hung in orbit like a silent leviathan as the medbay quieted, its patience stabilized. Mark Nolan sat on a bench in the observation chamber, his head resting against the cool glass. Below, the rescued crew of the Orion Dawn lay in recovery pods, their injuries mended or mending under the skillful hands of the Voroc medical team. Tyler approached silently, his pale gray skin almost blending into the dim light. He carried a small holographic projector, which he activated with a flick of his slender fingers. A three-dimensional representation of a human circulatory system flickered to life between them. "This is a model of your cardiovascular response during the rescue," Tyler began, his tone subdued yet thoughtful. "Your stress levels were beyond the limits that would incapacitate most species, and yet you continued to act, to exert, to care. It is profoundly illogical." Mark chuckled weakly, rubbing his temples. "You keep saying that like it's a bad thing." Tyler tilted his head, studying Mark with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "Perhaps it is not. Among my kind, injury and suffering are inconveniences, temporary states that our biology corrects without need for intervention. We do not care as you describe it. To us, survival is an individual responsibility, not a collective endeavor." "Sounds lonely," Mark muttered. Tyler raised an eyebrow. "It is efficient." Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You want to know why we care so much? Why we do stupid things like risk our lives for others? It's because we're all we've got. We don't regenerate like you. We don't bounce back from everything. If we didn't help each other, we wouldn't make it. So yeah, maybe it's not logical, but it's how we survive." Tyler considered this in silence, his amber eyes flickering with unspoken thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Your Captain Vega, when she wakes, she will credit you with saving her life. Yet your actions risked your own. How do you reconcile such a sacrifice?" "It's not a sacrifice if it's the right thing to do," Mark said simply. "And besides, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." Tyler seemed to absorb this, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he deactivated the hologram and clasped his hands behind his back. "Your species is perplexing. Fragile, reckless, and yet remarkable. You possess a strength that cannot be measured in regenerative capabilities or physical endurance." Mark smirked. "You're not going to start calling us inspirational, are you?" Tyler's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Not yet, but I believe there is value in studying your illogical persistence further." The conversation was interrupted by the faint chime of a communicator. Tyler touched the device embedded in his wrist, listening intently to the message. When he turned back to Mark, his expression had shifted to something almost solemn. "The Coalition Council has convened an emergency meeting. They wish to review humanity's application for full membership based on today's events." Mark straightened, his exhaustion forgotten. "That was fast." "Your actions on Aara 7 and aboard the Orion Dawn have been relayed to the Council by Voroc representatives," Tyler said. "There is a growing sentiment that your species possesses a unique form of strength, one that the Coalition would benefit from." Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Guess I better clean up then." When the council meeting commenced, Mark stood at the center of a vast chamber aboard the Coalition's orbital station. Alien representatives of all shapes and sizes filled the tiers of seats around him, their voices a low hum of speculation. Tyler stood at his side, a silent but reassuring presence. As Mark began his address, he spoke not about humanity's technological advancements or military capabilities, but about their resilience, their determination to protect one another, and their willingness to face insurmountable odds for the sake of what they believed in. He shared the story of Captain Vega, the young engineer, and the countless others who had been saved because humans refused to give up. When he finished, the chamber was silent. Then, one by one, the representatives signaled their approval. The Coalition's decision was unanimous. After the meeting, Tyler approached Mark, his expression softer than Mark had ever seen. "Ambassador Nolan, today your species has taught us a profound lesson. Strength is not merely a physical attribute. It is the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to care for others, even at great personal cost." Mark grinned, holding out his hand. "Glad you're starting to get it, Doc." Tyler hesitated briefly before clasping Mark's hand in a firm, deliberate grip. "Perhaps your species is not as fragile as I once believed." As the Coalition flag was raised to include Earth's symbol, Mark stood among his people, a wave of pride swelling in his chest. Humanity had found its place among the stars, not through power or might, but by showing the galaxy what it truly meant to be human. The celebration aboard the Star Strider was understated but heartfelt. The crew gathered in the observation deck, where the view of the Coalition orbital station shimmered against the backdrop of distant stars. Mark Nolan leaned against the railing, a glass of something vaguely celebratory in his hand, though he was too tired to care what it was. Across the room, Talir stood among a group of Vorocs, his towering form a contrast to the humans around him. He was speaking in his native tongue, his tone more animated than usual. Mark couldn't help but smirk. He'd never seen Talir look so engaged. Dr. Linara approached, her arms crossed and an eyebrow raised. "You know, I thought you were insane for agreeing to go on that ship with Talir. Turns out you were right, he's not as much of a stiff as I thought." "High praise," Mark said, taking a sip of his drink. "I'll be sure to tell him you approve." Linara laughed softly, then her tone grew more serious. "You really pulled it off, you know, getting Earth into the Coalition. That's a big deal." "Yeah," Mark said, staring out at the stars. "But it wasn't just me. It was all of us, every medic, every soldier, every engineer who's ever risked everything for someone else. I just told the story." Linara studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you told it damn well. Don't let it go to your head." Before Mark could reply, a shadow fell over them. He turned to see Talir standing there, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Ambassador Nolan, Talir said, his voice as calm and precise as ever. "I require a moment of your time." "Sure," Mark said, setting his glass down. "What's up?" Talir gestured for him to follow, and the two men stepped out onto a quieter observation platform. The silence of space stretched out before them, infinite and serene. Talir's expression was unreadable as he began to speak. "My people have long prided ourselves on our strength," he said, "our ability to heal, to endure. We believed it made us superior. But your actions, your species, have shown us a different kind of strength, one we did not understand." Mark leaned against the railing, his brow furrowed. "We're not perfect, Talir. We make mistakes, we screw up, and sometimes we barely scrape by. But we try. That's all we've got." Talir nodded slowly. "And that is extraordinary." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Talir reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small, intricately carved token. It glowed faintly with a soft, golden light. "This is a Voroc sigil," he said, placing it in Mark's hand. "It is given only to those who have demonstrated profound wisdom or strength. It is rarely bestowed outside our species. You have earned it." Mark stared at the sigil, its warmth surprising against his palm. "Wow," he said softly. "Thank you, Talir. This means a lot." Talir inclined his head. "It is a symbol of what we have learned from you. May it remind you that even the strongest can learn from those they once underestimated." As Mark looked out at the stars, the weight of the sigil in his hand, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Earth had proven its worth not through power or superiority, but by showing the galaxy the heart of humanity. In their fragility, they had found strength. In their flaws, they had found resilience. And in their willingness to care, they had found a place among the stars. Talir spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Your people are remarkable, Ambassador Nolan. I look forward to seeing how far your kind will go." Mark grinned, his gaze fixed on the infinite expanse before them. "So do I, Talir. So do I."